All right, get ready to deep dive, because today we're tackling the document that underpins the world's largest democracy. Talk about a challenge. It's the Indian Constitution.
Yeah.
And wow, you've really outdone yourself this time, haven't you? I mean, tables, excerpts, legal analyses. You're clearly on a mission to understand not just the rules, but the soul of India itself.
Well, it's certainly a journey of discovery, isn't it? Trying to unpack how a nation defines itself, especially one as diverse and historically rich as India.
It absolutely is. You're not shying away from the details either. We've got those, well, frankly, dense tables breaking down the Constitution's core principles. Looks like we're going full-on legal explorer today.
I'm ready.
Me too. But let's start, first things first with the preamble, the heart and soul, as they call it.
Always a good place to begin.
It's like the grand opening statement, and bam, right off the bat, you've got those iconic words, "We, the people of India."
Sets the tone, doesn't it?
Right. Gives me chills every time. It's a bold declaration, especially considering India's journey from, colonial rule to independence.
Absolutely. It establishes that core principle of popular sovereignty right from the get-go. This idea that the power of the nation flows from its people.
Not from, some king or emperor.
Exactly. Not from some external authority or inherited right. It's the people's nation.
Huge, especially given their history. But it doesn't stop there, does it? The preamble goes on to paint this picture of India as a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic.
Wowza, that's a mouthful.
I know. Each word so carefully chosen, representing a fundamental value that shapes India's identity. So like socialist, for instance. It's not like USSR or anything, right?
Right. It's not about embracing a rigid economic model, thankfully. It's more about a commitment to social justice. Meaning reducing inequality, making sure there's a fair distribution of wealth. Think of it as striving for balance. Sure, a market economy, but with, a heart.
Yeah.
A sense of responsibility.
So not just all about profits.
Right. And we see it reflected in things like India's labor laws, their social welfare programs. They're trying to find that balance.
Interesting. So socialist in the Indian context is more nuanced than how some might, particularly in the West, interpret it.
Without a doubt. It's about the approach, not just the outcome. And actually, speaking of nuance, the secular bit often raises eyebrows, especially these days.
Yeah, with religious tensions seemingly on the rise globally.
Yeah.
How does that work in such a religiously and spiritually diverse nation?
It's a great question, and unlike some countries that might aim for, a strict separation of religion and public life, Indian secularism takes a more inclusive approach, you could say.
Inclusive how?
It's more about ensuring the state doesn't play favorites. All religions are treated equally. It's about creating space for mutual respect and understanding.
So not about erasing religious identity, but making sure everyone can practice their faith without fear.
Precisely. Think of it like a mosaic.
Well, what?
A mosaic. Each piece, each faith contributes to the beauty and complexity of the whole picture.
I like that. But, these are grand ideals, but India is huge GE.
Yeah.
How do they actually put these into practice?
You're hitting on a crucial point. And that's where those detailed tables you gave us come in.
The ones I said made us legal explorers.
Those are the ones. They break down how these broad principles, like secularism, are actually translated into concrete actions and protections.
So it's one thing to say it. It's another to actually do it.
Exactly. For example, take Article 15. It prohibits discrimination based on religion, right there in the Constitution. And then there's Article 25, which guarantees freedom of conscience and the right to practice and share one's religion.
It's like they took those big ideas from the preamble and created a system to, actually enforce them.
Safeguards, you could say. Of course, no country perfectly embodies every ideal all the time.
Right, and looking at this fulfillment column in the table, it seems like there's a range, Some areas where India is nailing it, and others where, let's just say it's a work in progress.
It's a mixed bag, for sure. And that's where the conversation gets even more interesting. For example, India gets a lot of praise for its independent judiciary, right? And its pretty gutsy free press.
Both good signs for democracy.
For sure. But at the same time, there are these ongoing debates and challenges around things like caste-based discrimination and religious intolerance.
So it's a reminder that putting these ideals into practice is an ongoing process.
Absolutely. And we have to remember, even the preamble itself, this core document, it wasn't always as we see it today. It's gone through its own changes.
Oh, really? It's like, I was assumed it just kind of appeared fully formed.
Yeah, not quite. It highlights how dynamic India's constitution really is. Take the terms socialist and secular, the very ones we've been discussing. They weren't actually there originally. They were added later. In 1976.
Wait, seriously, the 1970s, what prompted such a significant change to something as, seemingly fundamental as the preamble? They didn't just decide to spice things up, did they?
Not exactly. The 1970s were a pretty turbulent period for India.
In what way?
They had economic challenges, social unrest, and, political turmoil. Indira Gandhi, the prime minister at the time, argued that explicitly putting socialist and secular in there would reaffirm their commitment to those values.
So it was a statement, like, this is who we are, this is what we stand for.
Precisely. It was about reinforcing the direction they wanted India to take as a nation. Which reminds us that context is everything, especially when you're trying to understand something as important as a country's constitution.
It's not just a dusty old document. It's a living, breathing testament to the country itself.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Now we've covered sovereign, socialist, and secular. Ready to hit our listener with democratic and republic? Or should we give them a breather?
Let's keep rolling. I think they can handle it. Okay, so you want the difference between democratic and republic, right?
Yeah.
2 words people throw around, but they have surprisingly distinct meanings, especially when you're talking about, the Indian Constitution.
Hit me with the distinctions.
All right, so think of it this way. Democratic, that's all about where the power comes from, the source of the authority. Republic, on the other hand, that's more about how that power is actually put into action, the structure of it all.
Interesting. Okay, broke it down for me.
Democratic means the people call the shots. It all comes back to them. And the clearest example of that in action is their system of universal adult suffrage. 1 person, 1 vote.
Which, when you think about it, is incredible, pulling that off in such a massive and diverse country.
Right. Not a simple feat. They had to work to make sure everyone was fairly represented, especially given, their history of inequality.
So democratic, everyone has a voice. What about republic then? Where does that fit in?
Republic means that instead of having a king or queen, someone who inherited their position, the head of state is an elected official.
So think the president of India.
Exactly. And that's huge. They hold an incredibly powerful position, but they're elected for a fixed term. And get this, their power is limited by the Constitution.
It all circles back to the people.
Precisely.
So these 2 ideas, democratic and republic, they work together to create the system of governance.
Checks and balances, making sure the power not only comes from the right place, but is used responsibly.
Smart. Speaking of which, let's get back to those tables you brought. The ones with all the details.
Ready to dive back in?
Let's do it. And this whole section on dignity of the individual caught my eye. I mean, it's a powerful idea, but also kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do you even define dignity in a way that applies to everyone?
It's definitely not as clear-cut as saying, the freedom of speech. But the Indian Constitution, it doesn't shy away from those tough questions, It embraces them.
Okay, so how does that play out? Translating this idea of dignity into actual rights.
It's about creating a society where everyone is treated with respect and has the chance to live a life where they feel valued.
Sounds good to me. But how do they make that happen, concretely?
Well, think about the abolishment of untouchability under Article 17, for example. That was huge.
It wasn't just about outlawing a practice, it was making a statement.
Right. It was saying that every single Indian citizen has inherent dignity no matter their caste.
That is powerful. It's more than just legal equality on paper. It's about addressing those deep-seated social and cultural things that can make someone feel less than.
It really adds another dimension to the whole conversation about equality and fairness, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And we see this idea of dignity popping up in other areas too, right?
Oh, definitely. Look at the protections against human trafficking. Forced labor. These aren't just about physical safety. They're about making sure everyone has control over their own lives. They're not a commodity.
So much of what we consider basic human rights really does tie back to that idea of dignity at its core.
Even something like the right to privacy, which the Indian Supreme Court recently upheld, is connected to this idea of individual dignity.
The right to live your life freely without interference. Makes sense.
It's all connected.
So we've got these principles, these guiding lights from the preamble, like dignity of the individual, that then get translated into action.
Setting a high bar for how they treat their people.
But of course, no country is perfect. Which brings us back to that fulfillment column. The reality check on whether they're living up to those ideals.
It's almost like trying to grade a nation's report card or something, isn't it?
Right. But someone's got to do it. So how's India doing?
Like we were saying before, it's a mixed bag. Some areas, they're really excelling, like those democratic elections. They're seen as a model for a lot of other countries.
And then there are the tougher areas.
Yes, there are areas where they still face challenges, like poverty, discrimination, access to healthcare and education.
It makes you wonder about those fulfillment scores. What would they look like if you went and asked everyday people about their experience?
Because at the end of the day, the Constitution is supposed to serve the people, right? Not just be words on a page.
Exactly. Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about the ideas in the preamble. But, our listener also included some really interesting stuff about the debates that happened while they were creating it. It wasn't just a walk in the park, huh?
Oh, definitely not. Those debates within the Constituent Assembly, those were heated. Can you imagine being tasked with crafting the very soul of a brand new nation?
I can't even imagine. What a responsibility. And with so many different opinions and perspectives in the room.
Things definitely got lively at times.
I bet. And our listener helpfully pointed out some of the big sticking points, like, get this, they even argued about whether to include the word God in the preamble. Can you believe that?
It's remarkable, right? And it wasn't just about being religious or not. It was about this really fundamental question of how you balance faith and secular government in a place as diverse as India. Some saw it as a way to acknowledge how important spirituality is in Indian culture, while others worried it would undermine the idea of religious freedom.
Wow, talk about pressure. Having to make those kinds of decisions at such a critical moment. And wasn't there even some debate about including Gandhi's name in the preamble? That seems crazy considering, he's like Gandhi.
It makes sense though, right? I mean, they weren't building a monument to the man.
Or like a foundation for a nation, yeah.
Exactly. And some argued that directly using his name, it could actually backfire.
How so?
It could have limited the Constitution's ability to, adapt and evolve over time.
Interesting. So they were thinking long term.
Big time. Which brings us to another important question about the preamble. How much power does it really have?
Yeah, it's beautifully written and all, but it's not like it's the law, is it?
That's where it gets interesting. For a while, it actually wasn't considered legally binding.
Really?
There was this case, Birubari, back in 1960. The Supreme Court ruled that, the preamble's important, sets the tone, but you can't really use it to challenge a law in court.
So just a nicely worded mission statement?
Pretty much, but then along came another case, the case of Ananda Parati case in 73. This one was a game changer.
What happened?
This time, the court said, hold on, the preamble is a vital part of the Constitution, and, get this, it can be used to interpret the other parts.
That's a big shift. Why the change of heart?
Basically, they realized that understanding the preamble is key to understanding the whole thing, like trying to, read a book without knowing what it's about.
Context is everything.
Right, and ignoring the preamble, that's like ignoring the context. So in the Kesavananda Bharati case, they came up with this idea of the basic structure of the Constitution.
Basic structure. Sounds kind of important.
It is. It means there are certain core principles that are absolutely untouchable. No changing them, even if Parliament wants to. It's like the foundation of the house. You can redecorate all you want, but you can't mess with the foundation.
And these untouchables, they're...
You guessed it. Sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, republic. Straight from the preamble. Those are non-negotiable.
So those words went from being this aspirational idea to this, bedrock legal principle.
It really highlights how much thought and care went into those early debates, doesn't it?
They were shaping the future of India, literally.
And they created this brilliant system, this balance between staying true to their values while also allowing the Constitution to grow and change with the times. Pretty amazing when you think about it.
It really is. Well, I have to say, this has been quite a deep dive. From those, shall we say, comprehensive tables to the ins and outs of the preamble to the courtroom dramas that shaped how we see it today. I feel like I've learned so much.
It's incredible what a single document can tell us about a nation's journey, isn't it?
It really is. But before we go, any final food for thought for our listeners?
We've covered a lot, but I'm left wondering, with all this talk of secularism, how might that play out with the push for a uniform civil code?
You mean having the same laws for things like marriage and inheritance for everyone, regardless of their religion?
Exactly. What do you think the implications of something like that might be, especially in a country as diverse as India? It's something to ponder.
That's a big question, and a great place to leave it for our listeners to mull over. A huge thank you to you for walking us through all of this.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on another deep dive.